Hey, how's it going? It's Grant with the Garden of Eater, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to build a tank stand like this one, or this one, or this one, or even this one. Alright, so before we get started, I want to point out I'm not an engineer. Everything I've done so far has just been self-taught. I had a saw in the garage, and from there I just kind of learned along the way. I know this might not be the best way to build a stand. I've done stands in different types of styles and formats. However, with this build, I find that it maximizes the amount of tanks that I can put on one wall where space is limited. And with this build, all of the weight is on the hardware itself, where other builds might have most of the tank weight actually supported on the actual wood itself, which might be safer in some situations. However, I take extra precautions by painting the wood, making sure that the hardware doesn't rust out, and then putting in these extra supports underneath just in case a worst case situation were to happen. I've got a little extra buffering situation. Now, the first thing we got to do is make the blueprint. This is going to be different for everybody depending on the space, the size of aquarium, and how big the stand they actually want to make it. For this rack, our limiting feature is going to be the height of our ceiling. At only 8 feet high, I wanted to make 4 rows for this stand. And I have to start off with having an 8-inch gap from the top of the tank to the ceiling. Then we're using 10-gallon aquariums with 4 rows. Each tank is going to be 12 3/4 inches high. And then I like the bottom row to sit about 5.5 to 6 inches off the ground. For this rack, we're going to do 5.5 inches. That way we have plenty of space to clean underneath the rack. And then you have to account for the 3.5 inches for each 2x4. And then if you take your remaining measurement and divide that by 3, that gives you your spacing in between the 10-gallon tanks and the 2x4 above it. For this rack, we've got 5 3/4 inches. Now, for the length of the stand, I usually like to have the least amount of cuts, use the least amount of wood possible. That's why I like these stands. With one 2x4 long, I can fit 9 10-gallon aquariums on it. Usually, I don't cut the wood at all, but for this wall, I'm trying to maximize space and build another rack, so I am going to cut off 1.5 inches off of these 2x4s for the length of the stand. And this means the length of the stand is 94.5 inches long. Alright, now to figure out how wide the stand is, you got to take in fact that the 10-gallon tanks are 20.25 inches long, and then you've got another 3 inches for the 2x4s, and then I like to give an extra 1/4 inch of gap to get 23.5 inches long for how wide the stand will be before I put on an extra leg. Because of how large these stands are, I do like to slap on another 2x4 to make them basically a 4x4 if they didn't cheap us out on wood beforehand. Now, if you take 23.5 inches and you subtract the 3 inches for the 2x4 legs and then 3 inches for the 2x4 horizontal supports, you get 17.5 inches, and those are going to be the center supports that we run underneath the tanks. And it's kind of like a guardrail system, so that way you can slide the tanks on and off, and it gives extra support for the stand to make it more sturdy overall. Now that the blueprint is done, I figured I need about 23, maybe 24 2x4s. So I'm going to get 24 just in case there's one that's maybe split or badly knotted or twisted that I didn't catch at the store. But I'm going to really take my time to make sure that doesn't happen. Now it's time to head to Home Depot to get the wood. Usually when I get there, 9 out of 10 times, it's a total disaster, and you've got everybody's discarded 2x4s right on top of the pallet. So really take some time, clean the pallet up, push everything over to the back, so that way you've got a fresh spot on the pallet to go through and pick out your wood. And at $3.36 a piece, you really want to make sure you take your time. I can't stress this enough. The straighter the wood, the better the wood, the easier the stand will be to put it together later. And watch out for knots. These are weaker spots in the wood. You want to avoid these to make sure you have the strongest stand possible. And you want to lay your 2x4s out and look down them to make sure that they're as straight as possible. Avoid any curves and double check for splits. This is the worst thing and easiest way to waste a 2x4 by bringing home one of these. And then when you're done, try to clean up the pile a little bit. Make sure you put the safety guards back in place. That way, it's not a mess for the next person. And while you're here, you might also want to grab your screws, sandpaper, and everything to paint with, and a fresh saw blade if you don't have it already. Now that you've got the wood at home, it's time to break out the saw and get cutting. Then I like to lay out all of the wood. It makes it really easy to find all the straight pieces. I put them up front so I can start on those with the horizontal supports and the legs. Then you always want to start cutting your longest boards first. That way, any of the scrap pieces that are long enough can be used later on in the stand when you're going through the smaller pieces. So then I mark out 8 of the 94.5-inch boards, and then I mark out 8 of the 75-inch boards. There won't be any scrap from the longer 94.5-inch boards, but these 75-inch boards, I'll have enough room to make it the 17.5-inch spacers and the 18.5-inch spacer as well. And then I cut 12 23.5-inch boards. Then I cut 2 18.5-inch boards. These won't actually be part of the stand, but these are going to be spacers to help me build the stand a little bit quicker. Then I'm going to cut out 28 17.5-inch boards. This is optional. You don't need quite this many. However, I figured this stand was going to be bulletproof, and I had a space for each one of the tanks to slide into their spot. And that's all of the wood for the entire stand. Now that I've got it all cut up, it's time to clean it up. Now, I didn't film this part, but I went ahead and sanded all of the cut pieces on all the ends of the 2x4s so that way they were nice and smooth and easy to paint. Now we bring all of the boards inside. We've got to build this stand inside for 2 reasons. One, it's super hot out in Florida and it helps me out by sitting in the AC to build it. And the second one is we've built too many racks inside the house and there isn't a way to build it outside and move the rack in its place inside. So we've got to build it basically where it's got to go. Then I take 3 of the 23.5-inch boards and I cut them out 1 inch deep, 6 inches wide, and about 6 inches from the side, so that way the lights can slide through and actually fit on the rack instead of sitting on top of the tanks. After I've got the first one cut, I can use that one as a template to cut the other ones. Sometimes I just do the center boards, but if you want, you can do all of them. Just remember, you don't need to do the ones on the very bottom because there can't be lights underneath the rack. Now it's time to get everything organized. Of course, the dog is always asleep on the job. And then these are the screws that we use. And before we start drilling in, you want to make sure that you pre-drill all of your holes. This way, it prevents any of the wood from splitting. And then you want to make sure that you drill out both sides. Here I stacked the wood so that I didn't have to run around and drill out all the different pieces. I've got it all right here in one area to make all of my drill holes. Then you want to start getting the frame all squared up. The vertical legs go down on the floor and then the horizontal supports go on top of the legs. And then before you screw in the top horizontal support, make sure that all of the legs and corners are all square. Sometimes the board starts to come up when you're screwing it in. Just reverse the drill and then screw it back in and it'll make it nice and flush. Then get 1 or 2 screws on each side and double check to make sure everything is still flush and everything is square. And then we're going to take our 18.5-inch spacers to add on the second horizontal support. Remember to check that everything is all square before you screw it in. And then we're going to repeat that with the next 2 horizontal supports. And then we're going to add the center beam by using the 23.5-inch boards as spacers underneath the horizontal supports to evenly space out the center leg, so that way only a little bit of the aquariums are hidden behind this leg and overlap, giving the better view of the tanks. And then we pre-drill the holes and then screw in the center leg. Then using the 8.5-inch spacers, we can screw the center leg into the remaining horizontal supports. Now the first side is complete, and we can move this one out of the way to build another one. Now this side is going to be built the exact same way, except for the center beams are going to be spaced out on the opposite side using the 23.5-inch boards. Now it's time to put the two halves together. Take the 17.5-inch pieces and place them standing up on top of the first side. You don't need all of the pieces, just some of them will do. Then get the 23.5-inch boards ready and in place. Then, with help of another person, I was able to use my 12-year-old son. This stand is not that heavy. You place it carefully over the top of the 17.5-inch boards, so that way the two stands are nice and flush with one another. Also, you'll notice that the two sides are now flush with the 23.5-inch boards that are standing up on the floor. Then starting with the four corners, screw in the 23.5-inch boards using 1 or 2 screws in each side and double checking that the entire thing is square each time you screw in a new board. Now you can safely screw in all the rest of the 23.5-inch boards. And then remember using the ones that you cut off the little notches for the lights in the center of the boards. Now you can place on the rest of the 17.5-inch boards, spacing them out every 10.5 inches. That way each one of the 10-gallon tanks can slide onto these 17.5-inch boards. I did leave one out of the middle of the stand though, because of the center legs. I won't be able to slide in a tank here anyways, so it is going to use one of the other tank's rails to get into its position. Then pre-drill all of the holes and screw in all of the 17.5-inch boards. Now you can stand the rack up and screw in the other side. Now don't forget to pre-drill, and you want to make sure that the 17.5-inch boards are nice and flush with the horizontal supports going across. And then a quick sand over all of the screws, so that way painting is a little easier. And now the stand is ready for paint. And you definitely don't want to skip out, because remember, all of the weight is on the hardware and you want to prevent any rust that you possibly can. So sealing up all the little nooks and crannies that you can in between the pieces of wood will help prevent any of the rust from happening in the future. So you don't want to skip out on these next two steps. You want to get the primer all ready to go, and we suggest that you start with the bottom of the stand, get a nice 2 coats on the bottom, so that way when it's dry you can flip it up and really take your time and coat the entire stand with the primer. And you don't want to just skip the primer and go straight to oil paint either. If you do that, then the wood is simply going to suck up a lot of the oil paint, and you're going to use a lot more money, and it's going to take you a lot longer to paint the stand. Now, this oil paint isn't necessarily fun to work with. It is probably the messiest thing that we do here at the house. It is a mess. You make sure you put down some type of cloth or something like that so you don't get it all over the place. And then, good luck cleaning the paintbrushes. A little tip we found, that if you take your paintbrush when it's wet, you can put it in a Ziploc bag, seal it nice and tight, and it's actually good up to 5 days, and you can keep using it and not have to clean it off. And then we do recommend a nice 2 coats of the oil paint, and this is what we have found the best way to kind of waterproof the wood and make it last as long as possible. Besides that, the finish, the look, everything about this stand is just, It's really nice, it's really appealing, and it goes well in our home. And there you have it. That's how you can build your very own Tgoe stand. It's basically how we built all of the stands in our entire house, including this one behind me. It's basically the exact same stand, built an extra row higher, so that way I can maximize those 2x4s. And it's basically two of those stands put together to make one big stand to hold 90 10-gallon tanks. So there you have it. We'll have another video in the future on how to build them slightly different if you're not too worried about that wall space, and it gives you a little extra support, and it is a little bit safer going forward. So that'll be in the future. Stay tuned, hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.